Hello and welcome to today's module, Motivation. What's yours? How can we improve our effort to improve our results? Primary source of the information from this module comes out of our Weinberg and Gould Foundations of Sport and Exercise Psychology, 7th edition textbook. Our learning objectives for this module are to define motivation and self-determination theory, identify and describe achievement motivation theories, describe learned helplessness, and discuss guidelines for developing and sustaining motivation. Before we go too far, we want to be able to define motivation. Well, essentially, motivation is defined as the direction and intensity of our effort. The direction really refers to our seeking out of situations and challenges. Do we approach situations? Are we attracted to certain situations? And our intensity refers to how much effort we're willing to put into an event or a situation. We are driven by two broad types, intrinsic and extrinsic motivation. In this module, we'll explore primarily the intrinsic motivation that drives us. Intrinsic motivation really boils down to three fundamental factors. In science, they have determined that as human beings, we have certain psychological factors that affect our motivation. These three factors, we can call them the ABCs of intrinsic motivation, also known as self-determination theory, which are the antecedents to motivation, are autonomy, belonging, and competence. Autonomy is simply our ability to interact with the environment without anybody else around. It's our ability to have control in the environment and have a choice. It's very important that we have autonomy in order to build intrinsic motivation. Belonging refers to our feeling in a sense of belonging to a community, to a group, to the team, and being able to love and be loved by others. Competence, well, this is our self-efficacy. How much confidence do we have in our ability to perform a task in the situation when it's required? One way we can look at measuring our intrinsic motivation is by asking ourselves three questions. Can I do it? Will it work? And is it worth it? If we answer yes to all three of these questions, we're on the right path. We can work within that framework and build on our intrinsic motivation. However, if you answer no to any one of these questions, we have to take a look at which question it is you are answering no to, and then come up with a game plan to help facilitate that answer to change to a yes. So for instance, a can I do it is all about your self-efficacy, your competence in the task at hand. If you're not competent in it, well, then we got to work on setting goals to help build confidence and competence in that task. Will it work deals with Albert Bandura's response efficacy, which essentially relates to, do you think the plan will work? Is the plan that's set forth in front of you a plan that you can say, yes, that will work? Because if not, if you say no to that, well, then maybe we have to redevise the plan. Come up with a plan that you see will work. And last one is it worth it? Deals with our perception of the consequences, both good and bad consequences. Are the consequences worth it? If you say no to that one, well, then we need to figure out what would motivate you. What consequences will change that answer to a yes? Understanding our intrinsic motivation and the components that make up our intrinsic motivation is only part of the puzzle of developing motivation and sustaining it. The other part is how we approach the study of it and our view of it. In sport and exercise science, there are three approaches to motivation. There's trait-centered, situation-centered, and interactional view. We're really going to focus in on the interactional view because that is the most widely accepted and endorsed approach by sport and exercise psychologists. This really boils down to both traits, personality traits, and situational factors play a big role in our motivation. And by viewing this conversely to trait-centered or situation-centered alone allows us to take in the complexities of us as human beings interacting with both our personality and environment. A way that we can conceptualize this approach is to separate it into two components, working together, and then that participant taking those two components and then having the motivation be a byproduct of that. So personal factors such as your personality, your goals, your interests, Those things play a big role in your motivation. On the other end, you have situational factors. And if we're looking at the sporting environment, especially those that are going to participate on a team, you might look at the coach's style. Are the facilities up to date? Are they adequate or even more than adequate than what you need? Does the team have a winning or losing record? Right? These are all situational factors that play an important role in determining the participant's behavior. Put those together, mill that around in the individual's head, out comes their motivation. So essentially, understanding one's personality and situation, we can help create an environment to enhance motivation. Now let's apply this interactional approach to coaching. Okay, because knowing one's personality alone will not always give us an indication of that performance. And knowing the situation alone won't always enable us to predict somebody's performance. That's why the interactional approach is so important. Now, what we've learned, and this is based on a study of swimmers, is that there are those individuals that are more approval-oriented rather than rejection-threatened. So approval-oriented individuals really seek out that social support and the social accolades that they get from their teammates, whereas others are really fearful of failure, and they're fearful of the comments or the thoughts of their teammates. And this really can play a big role in, as a coach, who you select for certain events. So in swimming, there are two types of events. There are the individual medley events, and there are team events, such as the relay. Now, if you have the fastest swimmer in an individual medley, that does not automatically mean they're going to be the fastest person in a relay event. Because if that individual is very fast in that individual medley, however, they have a rejection threatened take on the social environment, they're actually going to perform worse in a team or relay event because they're going to be considering and worried about the failure and how the team would react to the failure. Whereas you may have an individual that in the individual medley event might be second, third, or even fourth in speed there. However, they are approval oriented, meaning that they look for that social support. They can't wait to do something good and have that teammate say, great job. And those individuals actually perform better in those team relay events. And so understanding this dynamic can help you actually set your lineups and improve the performance of the team and the outcomes of the team. That leads us to understanding how to choose people for team events versus individual events, team sports versus individual sports. That leads us to our theories. We have 4 achievement motivation theories. All these theories work together to help us develop a picture of ourselves and the athletes we work with. The 4 theories are need achievement theory, attribution theory, achievement goal theory, and competence motivation theory. Let's take a look at these. Let's take a look at the need achievement theory. Now, this need achievement theory is an interactional viewpoint. You can see here there are 5 components: the personality factors, situational factors, which make up that interactional component, and they lead to a resultant tendency, emotional reactions, and achievement behaviors. Now, there are 2 personality factors that play a role in this. You're either motivated to achieve success or motivated to avoid failure. Think of yourself. Become a little more self-aware right now. Do you tend to be more fearful of failure, or are you motivated to achieve success? And how can you determine that? Well, when you calculate the probability of success, do you approach that situation with the idea that you want to focus in on the pride of success, or do you maybe avoid a situation because you focus on the shame of failure? Right? So those all play a factor in this theory. So let's take down the line of motivation to achieve success. You calculate the probability of success and the situation suits you well. You have an approach mentality as opposed to avoidance mentality, and you're focusing in on the pride of success. That's going to lead you to looking for challenging situations. You're going to seek out those things that you want to achieve, and it's really going to lead to an enhanced performance when the pressure's on. Whereas if you are motivated to avoid failure, you have now calculated that there's little value in the success of that. So is it worth it? Going back to that question, is it worth it? You said no. Now you're going to avoid those situations because the shame of failure outweighs anything else that you can imagine. And you're typically going to perform poorly. Overall, high achievers have a motivation to achieve success. They persist in the face of failure, and they really take pride in the accomplishment. For somebody who is a high achiever, they tend to seek out 50-50 competitive situations, meaning that it's a coin toss who's going to win. That's their ideal situation because that's the greatest challenge. You don't know. You're going up against a great competitor. For those that are motivated to avoid failure, they tend to choose situations that are really easy or really difficult because there's no shame in losing to an opponent that is way better than you. There's no risk in competing against somebody who you're way better than. Next, we have the attribution theory. Now, what this theory is basically all about, it's about what do we attribute to successes and failures. Have you ever listened to a post-game interview with a coach or an athlete? What do you hear them state? You hear them state causes for their successes and failures. Comments range from statements about themselves, their teammates, their coaches, the weather, officiating, something in the environment, maybe the crowd was a reason for their success or for their failure, or maybe even they attribute it to a higher power. By analyzing these statements, we can actually develop a broader picture of how one approaches achievement. Think about your last successes and failures. What do you attribute those things to? Here you have a list of attributions. The categories are stability. Is it stable, something that's not changing, or unstable, something that's changeable? Is the locus of causality internal to you, or is it external to you? Is it something in the environment? And then the locus of control. Is it in your control, or was it something out of your control? Now, our attributions actually have a psychological result. This typically is the result of one's motivation to either achieve success or avoid failure. The psychological result determines how one thinks about their expectancy for future success, how it's going to emotionally impact them, whether it be the pride of accomplishment or the shame of failure, and then their emotional influence on their motivation as well. When one tends to be motivation to avoid failure, there's a decrease in motivation caused by a lack of expectancy of future success and an increase in need to avoid shame. Take a minute, just familiarize yourself with the stability factors, causality factors, and control factors, and their psychological result. Expectancy of future success, the emotional influences both of causality and control factors. Now let's take a look at achievement goal theory. This theory contends that an individual's goal orientation and their perceived ability interact to determine their motivation. This motivation in turn leads to achievement behaviors in areas such as performance, effort, persistence, and their choice in either the tasks that they do or their opponents. In terms of goal orientation, outcome goal orientation really refers to the focus on the result of an event, whereas task goal orientation refers to the focus on acquiring the skills and mastering the skills required to have successful outcomes. The two big differences in these achievement goal orientations is that outcomes are not in our control, whereas mastering a task is more in our control because we can control our effort, our attitude, and the amount of time that we spend trying to master the task. Our perceived ability relates to our confidence in the skills required. This confidence is built through goal achievement in and of itself, being able to have successful results and experiences that lead to a deepening of our competence in an area, and a deepening of our self-efficacy. One of the underlying foundations of achievement motivations really lies in how do we view success and failure, and how that interacts with our perception of competence, self-worth, and ability as it relates to the demands of the environment. So the main takeaway from the achievement goal theory that science has given us is that we need to be more task goal oriented, and we need to build our competence to have a high perceived ability because those two combined will lead to greater performance, increased effort, persistence through adversity, and choosing realistic tasks and opponents. Our final achievement motivation theory is competence motivation theory. This theory helps explain the differences in achievement behavior, primarily in children, but we can all learn a lesson from this. It contends that individuals are motivated to feel self-worth and competence. And if you can think back to the beginning of this module, what other theory does that correlate to? If you said self-determination theory, ding, 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 you are correct. Since learning a new task is imperative to success and gaining self-confidence in learning a new task is critical to our feeling of competence, it's critical that we know how to teach skills, right? If we are able to improve competence, we are able to improve motivation, especially intrinsic motivation. This really comes down to our understanding of how to deliver feedback and reinforcement. Because when we give feedback and reinforcement, we can either build up and develop self-esteem, or we can absolutely destroy it. And those that have received criticisms and destructive criticism, you just know how badly that hurts your competence. So it's critical that as leaders and coaches, we know how to give appropriate feedback and reinforcement in order to help develop that motivation among individuals and groups, help them sustain it, and build that intrinsic motivation. The key to putting this all together is understanding the development of motivation and competitiveness. What is competitiveness? Well, it's really defined as an attitude of striving for satisfaction when making comparisons to some other standard of excellence while being evaluated. Think of your competitiveness. Are you highly competitive, moderately competitive, barely competitive? It all developed during the ages of probably between birth and 9 years old. From the ages of 0 to 5, we're in the autonomous competence stage. This is when we compare ourselves to just ourselves. We're trying to master our environment. This is things like learning to walk, ride a bike, or foundational sports skills or athletic skills such as running, jumping, throwing, kicking, tumbling. You know, when we're in that stage, we're not really caring about what others are doing. We're having fun, learning what we're learning, but we're trying to master these. And if we don't master them by a certain age, we tend to get to the social comparison stage and discover that we don't stack up with our friends. And this is where we can actually lose motivation and lose competitiveness to stay physically active. So it's really important that as coaches and as leaders that we learn how to foster that mastery of environment in young athletes, and not even just young athletes, just young kids. So in the social comparison stage, you measure yourself compared to your peers, and then you determine, am I excelling? Am I being selected for elite teams or encouraged to train more? Or am I being left behind? And again, when you start being left behind, that affects your motivation, that affects your competence, that affects your competitiveness. And the last stage that we find ourselves in is the integrated stage. And this is when you balance between self-comparison and social comparison. And with the right coaching and encouragement and social support, we can develop a healthy sense of competition and motivation that will help us improve our skills and improve our competence, all leading to improved intrinsic motivation. So I'd like to think that it would always be a positive experience, but what are some of the negative consequences that happen when we don't do the right things with young kids and teach them and reinforce and give them proper feedback? One negative consequence with mismanaged feedback and reinforcement is learned helplessness. You may ask, what is learned helplessness? How do you define it? Well, it's really the feeling of being apathetic. And that apathy derives from the sense that no matter how much effort I'm putting into something, the results seem to always be the same. Have you developed this attitude towards something? Have you just accepted, like, this is just the way it is, I'm never going to change it? So maybe you don't try it anymore. That's usually what happens, is by the time you have learned helplessness, you've learned to avoid those situations. Now, remember, this is not a personality flaw. It's really the result of having the wrong goal orientation. It's having an outcome goal orientation, only measuring your success by the results. This leads to maladaptive achievement tendencies, negative experiences, and really It's going to lead to us attributing things to uncontrollable factors. And at the end of the day, it will lead to low perceived ability. Overall, learned helplessness will affect our learning. So how do we correct that? How can we correct it within ourselves? And how can we correct it in others? First, it requires individual attention. You can't have a cookie cutter solution. We're all complex and we all have differing things that have caused this. So we've got to take an individual approach to it and an interactional approach. We want to instill pursuing task goal orientation or mastery of the task. We want to reframe our attributions to be healthy attributions. And with each success, we need to be able to give the proper feedback and reinforcement to help change that perception of ability. Our biggest obstacle? Well, it takes time and hard work on everyone's part to change the direction and intensity of somebody's motivation. But it can be done, and we need to work toward it. We need to help those that are experiencing learned helplessness to rise above and improve their performance by improving their intrinsic motivation. All of this leads us to developing some guidelines on how we can build and develop and maintain motivation. So some basic guidelines: take an interactional approach. We're complex. It's necessary that we think about the situation and traits. Remember that people are motivated by multiple things, but there's three basic needs that we have, right? The self-determination theory, autonomy, belonging, and competence. Develop those, and you'll develop motivation. We want to be able to provide an environment that's both competitive and fun. And how do you do that? Well, you create cooperative games, recreational environments. That makes it competitive and fun, because at the end of the day, if we're so overly competitive and it's no longer fun, people are going to lose motivation. People are going to burn out. So both competitive and fun environments. And then we have to influence with enthusiasm. If you've ever been around those enthusiastic coach, people that are passionate about what they do, you can't help but feed off of that. And that drives our motivation. And lastly, there are times we need to use behavior modification. We'll talk more about this in a different module, but using feedback and reinforcement properly will enable us to help build self-determination theory within each and every one of our athletes. Thank you so much for your time, energy, and effort in this module. Please let me know if you have any questions. Have a great day.